Thank you again for having me here. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope that the conference is going well. I haven't been able to attend much of it at all because I have been finishing up my semester, grading exams and going to graduation and things like that. So it's a pleasure to be here, if only virtually. I wish I could be there with you. So I will go ahead and just get started. The talk that I had planned to give and the talk that I'm giving are somewhat different creatures, and I hope that you'll bear with me as I toggle back and forth between the rhetorical analysis of the term vegan and plant-based that I had originally planned, and a series of recent events that I'm going to kind of deconstruct that have taken place in the United States that require attention and comment. So this talk is going to be in 4 parts. The first one's called Vegan Studies and the COVID-19 Pandemic. The second one is Eco-Criticism, Animal Studies, and the Vegan Turn. The third is Win Bruce, Climate Intervention and Retrograde Humanism. And finally, the fourth is called Tricks of Rhetoric, Plant-Based Politics, Misogyny, and the Erasure of the Empathetic Imperative. So I'm not sure that I'll be able to make explicit the connections that I really want to make in this talk, but perhaps they will be there implicitly. So I want to start by saying that I'm a professor of English who specializes in post-colonial literatures, primarily works from South Africa, Nigeria, India, and the Caribbean. And I also am a specialist in environmental literature. So my work is very much about reading texts. So please consider this talk as a series of cultural textual analyses read through a vegan ecofeminist lens. In 2018, Simon C. Estock addressed the often troubling absence of the animal question in discussions of climate change and in terms of the myriad challenges we face in the Anthropocene. The result, he said, is a kind of hollow ecology in which critical discussions of the animal question and vegetarianism are often simply dismissed or ignored, thus foreclosing on the possibility of generating an ethical scale appropriate for the enormity of the problems that we face, unquote. So on November 5th, 2019, 11,000 scientists from 153 countries tried to make us aware of that scale as they declared a climate emergency. And the report presents in stark terms the nature and uncertainty of the crisis. Providing 6 paths forward, one of which focuses specifically on agriculture. Quote, eating mostly plant-based foods while reducing the global consumption of animal products can improve human health and significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions, unquote. And then, sort of immediately after that, all productive discussion and political capital seemed to be immediately shifted, along with our collective attention to dealing with the crisis of another order, the global COVID-19 pandemic. Even though, of course, most of us know the pandemic and the environmental crisis of climate change are very much interconnected. So let me move on to let's see if I get the slide. Okay. The 1918 flu pandemic was avian in origin. COVID-19 may have emerged from animals in a live market in Wuhan, China. But as Tom Van Doren notes, if the pangolin does turn out to be the unwitting and unwilling culprit behind this pandemic, this unlucky animal will join a long list of others whose life was cut short, whose species was endangered, and whose environment was destroyed by a diverse range of ongoing human activities that are simultaneously helping to engineer new zoonotic diseases, unquote. In a special June 2020 issue of Bifrost called Through the Portal of COVID-19, Visioning the Environmental Humanities as Community of Purpose, to which I contributed, the editors asserted the fact that in this moment, quote, a virus carries the message of our interbeing across bodies, species, continents. COVID-19 is a vegan issue. The pandemic is an environmental issue, and has even proven to be an impetus for reordering the social contract in terms of rights, at least very much in my country. And much of what I'm going to talk about has to do with the United States. So I'm hoping that I provide enough context that will make sense. For example, in the US, the police murder of George Floyd in May of 2020 led to massive national protests against the killing of unarmed Black Americans by police. And the space afforded to our society by the work stoppages and lockdowns allowed social justice movements like this protest to foment and gain traction. In the aftermath, however, we have found our space filled with the manufactured outrage over what the political right refers to as critical race theory, a term that has been appropriated to silence and chill efforts in education to discuss the legacy of slavery in the US. Novels like Toni Morrison's masterwork, Beloved, are being banned. Same thing with Art Spiegelman's Mouse, presumably because it depicts Nazis as the bad guys in World War II. And despite all the strides toward that happened as a result of the Me Too movement, the rise of authoritarian regimes across the globe has led to a backlash against women's bodily autonomy. Just this week, in fact, and this is kind of where I got a bit derailed from my original talk, a leaked US Supreme Court opinion indicates that the Supreme Court of the United States is poised to overturn the landmark 1973 decision in Roe versus Wade, the decision that made abortion a federally protected right in the United States. According to Aliera Haradansi, in a 2020 piece in the New York Times called Across the Globe, a Serious Backlash Against Women's Rights, the rollback of women's protections doesn't impact just women, but goes hand in hand with an overarching decline in human rights. Or, as the UN Rights Council put it, quote, the corrosion of women's rights is a litmus test for the human rights standards of a whole society, unquote. And if human rights are in decline, non-human animal rights are more likely than not completely off the table. Prior to the pandemic, those 11,000 scientists from 153 countries had given us a plan to help us mediate the current crisis. But what will it take for us to act on it, or for that matter, to discuss the animal question in ways that are not predicated on vitriolic fear and willful disdain of plant-based consumption? I write from the US at a time when a refusal to acknowledge and critique the environmental impact of animal agriculture is apparent in discussions of what started out as a policy called the Green New Deal in 2018, a climate change non-binding resolution so general yet so polarizing that it has been trumpeted by its supporters as a way to avoid planetary destruction and vilified by opponents as a socialist plot to take away your ice cream. So in this essay, I offer a vegan studies approach as a theoretical and lived ecofeminist intervention in a US political moment and global moment as well, characterized by environmental uncertainty, overt racism, misogyny, and anti-immigrant policies that have become conflated with the presumed threat that veganism, both a term and as an identity category, poses to an increasingly authoritarian present. Within the context of the mainstream hegemonic environmental movement in the academic frameworks of eco-criticism and animal studies, agricultural practices, factory farming, animal welfare, and meat consumption have been subjects of debate and concern. That said, the term vegan appears nowhere in Cheryl Glotfelty and Harold Fromm's foundational 1996 collection, The Eco-Criticism Reader, Landmarks in Literary Ecology. In 2011, veganism did warrant a single mention in Greg Garrard's Eco-Criticism, The New Critical Idiom, the text that defined the parameters of eco-critical study. Within the field of animal studies, veganism has always been a consideration, but it is also an ethical delineator that for many scholars constitutes an impenetrable boundary between theoretical pursuit and lived experience. Within animal studies approaches, scholars often theorize about animals even as they continue to ingest and exploit them. In Laurie Gruen's 2018 Critical Terms for Animal Studies, vegan finally warrants a chapter in which Annie Potts and Philip Armstrong claim that, quote, with the emergence of animal studies, the word vegan has begun to function as a critical term, unquote, constituting in discussions about whether the field should be vegan, one of the major ethical and political debates of animal studies as a discipline is this question of veganism. In this ongoing debate, Stephanie Jenkins recognizes that even in the face of atrocities done to animals, many animal studies scholars remain ambivalent about or even hostile to applying their arguments to practical implications, unquote. Given these circumstances, for many ethical vegan scholars, animal studies has fallen short of offering a fully satisfactory space for scholarly and activist engagement. That said, vegan ecofeminists have long recognized the potential importance of a fully vegan theoretical lived practice. In a 2012 issue of Hypatia titled Feminists Encountering Animals, Scholars unpacked this history and examined how feminist and ecofeminist perspectives productively trouble the ways that animal studies should consider actual animals. In this issue, Tracy Wartenkin addresses the animal studies vegan debate, recognizing, quote, connections between problematically uncritical promotion of veganism and a seemingly lack of presence of environmental ecofeminist praxis in animal studies generally. Ecofeminists have made veganism a central aspect of their discourse, even as their contributions have also often been erased, ignored, or rebranded within animal studies. And this is a point I'm going to come back to later in the talk. Gard has called out this revisionism, asking for a recuperation of the, quote, history of feminist eco-criticism and the contributions of ecofeminist literary criticism within eco-critical work that includes foundational scholarship by people like Carol J. Adams, Dean Curtin, Josephine Donovan, and many others. According to Gard, the erasure of vegan ecofeminist perspectives constitutes, quote, a failure to grapple with the issues being raised by that scholarship as feminist, a failure made more egregious when the same ideas are later celebrated when presented by non-feminist sources. The animal studies groundwork of vegan feminists and ecofeminists is barely mentioned in the currently celebrated field of posthumanism, yet feminist scholarship both predates and helpfully complicates that work. So I write as a social ecofeminist, recognizing that the oppressions of animals, women, colonized subjects, and nature are linked and reinforcing, prefaced upon the evaluation of those things that are culturally associated with, although not essentially characteristic of, masculinity, humanity, culture, and reason, over those things deemed feminine, animal, natural, and emotional. At occasional odds with animal studies and informed by and frustrated with the omission and denunciation of ecofeminism from a more holistic eco-critical animal studies practice, those of us practicing ethical veganism and theorizing from a vegan position have offered vegan studies as an ecofeminist methodology that is fully vegan in its animal and environmental advocacy, believing that our veganism functions as an identity category and ethical position that shapes the way we read text and the world more broadly. A vegan studies perspective, among other things, offers textual analyses from a vegan point of view. In 2015, I wrote a book called The Vegan Studies Project, Food, Animals, and Gender in the Age of Terror, to propose vegan studies as a field that is a product of the discourse of vegan representation, situated both within and outside of animal studies, animal welfare and rights and liberation, and ecofeminism. The job of this work was to unpack the tension between the dietary practice of veganism and the manifestation, construction, and representation of vegan identity in order to show how vegan studies provides a new lens for eco-critical textual analysis. So I'm going to just kind of back up for just a second. So that's just a little bit of the background of where, my work has come from. And I want to talk about this man named Bruce Wynn, because this is something that happened in the United States on Earth Day that has really just kind of left me reeling. I want to back up and discuss a moment from the immediate past and thread it through the climate crisis, the pandemic, and veganism. According to Ellie Silverman and Ian Chaparra's reporting in the Washington Post on April 22nd, 2020, Earth Day, a man from Colorado named Wynn Bruce set himself on fire on the steps of the United States Supreme Court building. Quote, he didn't scream, he didn't cry out in pain. The fire-consuming Wynn Bruce's body raged for 60 seconds before it was extinguished by police, and he remained still, sitting upright on the court's famous marble plaza, his legs stretched out in front of him, unquote. He was 50 years old, a devout Buddhist, and his immolation was an act of protest, according to his father, quote, a fearless act of compassion about his concern for the environment, an act of self-sacrifice and confrontation of the US history's inaction on dealing with catastrophic climate change. He died the very next day of his injuries, and his death was barely covered in the national news. So I want to discuss Bruce's death for several reasons, not the least of which is the fact that the grief he must have felt for what we've done and continue to do to our planet must have been unbearable. And his decision to take himself out of the picture is what I consider to be an environmental intervention that answers the argument that's often leveled against veganism, So this is going to be a little bit of a flip. This is an argument that was posited by Harold Fromm in a 2010 editorial that he wrote for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and which also prompted me to start writing the Vegan Studies project. So this is Fromm. That he's an eco-critic and also one of the co-editors of the Eco-Criticism Reader, which is sort of the foundational text in eco-criticism or eco-critical studies that came out in the 90s. He wrote, the grandstanding of vegans for carefully selected life forms to serve their own sensitivities through their meat and dairy-free diets, their avoidance of leather and other animal products doesn't produce much besides a sense of their own virtue. As they make their footprint smaller and smaller, will they soon be walking on their toes like ballet dancers? And if so, what's the next step after that? Pure spirit, an euphemism for bodily death? And if our existence is the problem, which it is, then only non-existence can cure it. The supreme biocentric act is not to discover yet one more animal product to abstain from. The supreme biocentric act is dying, returning the finite matter and energy you have appropriated for yourself and giving them back to the creatures you stole them from. And what makes them so pure? Are they shedding tears as they tear you and each other apart? The real crime is existence, not being or using animals. So I think Fromm's position is sort of a perfect articulation of what Carol Adams has termed retrograde humanism. And I really love this term. It's the familiar critique often leveled at vegans by non-vegans who rage at us for being inconsistent. So, these familiar arguments. So you love animals, but what about children? So you don't eat meat, but you purchase running shoes from companies that exploit human labor. If you aren't completely consistent, then you shouldn't do anything, is the message. Retrograde humanism, Adams points out, happens when people who are not vegan assert their own humanism in the face of what feels like an ethical confrontation. Quote, finding out that they might be doing more, they accuse vegans of doing less. In such a construction, animal activism or veganism functions to lead one into an infinite ethical regression. The only way to be genuine or good enough in such a formulation is not to do anything or to kill oneself, because if someone does something, one is held to a standard that immediately assumes that one is not doing enough. Okay, so it's a little bit of a logic problem. It's the reason for the tension that underscores the relationship between Beatrice Luna, and sorry, just a pop culture reference, one of my favorite films of all times, between Beatrice Luna, portrayed by Salma Hayek, the immigrant, vegan, empathetic female protagonist of Mike White and Miguel Arteta's 2017 film Beatrice at Dinner, and John Lithgow's big game hunter and capitalist developer Doug Strutt. So here's a poster for that. There's Mike White. Doug talks about going to South Africa to hunt big game and passes around a cell phone photo of a rhino he kills, claiming, I don't consider it murder, but rather an original dance between man and beast, man and nature. Beatrice, furious, responds, you think killing is hard? Try healing something. That is hard. You can break something in 2 seconds, but it can take a lifetime to fix it. Doug counters, quote, the world doesn't need your feelings. It needs jobs. It needs what I do. When she tells him that the world is dying and that his death will touch him as well, that he cannot hide from it, he laughs and says, the world is dying. Accept it and enjoy yourself, unquote. If you can't save it all, do nothing. So back to Wynne Bruce for just a second, and from what Fromm would certainly declare his supreme biocentric act. Before he was in a near fatal car accident at the age of 17. 18, he was an avid runner. So am I. He was 50 when he died. I'm 52. He became a photographer. He became involved in Buddhism and was committed to the Shambhala movement and attended retreats at the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center. I can't find verification anywhere that Wynne was vegan, and I really went down a rabbit hole trying to find out, but I kind of suspect that he was, based on all that I've read, and given that he was a proponent of Eco-Dharma, a meditative practice that David Lloyd defines as combining, quote, the teachings of Buddhism and related spiritual traditions with ecology or ecological concerns. A bit more specifically, eco-dharma can be understood as a new development in contemporary Buddhism in response to the ecological crisis that now threatens civilization as we know it, and perhaps even the survival of our species. or perhaps even enriched by our understanding of the field of ecology. Further, Louie points out three aspects of ecodharma that are essential, quote, practicing in nature, clarifying the ecological implications of Buddhism, and using that understanding to engage the eco-activism that our situation requires, unquote. Louie is one of the founders of the Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center, and in his book on ecodharma, Louie advocates for a vegetarian diet while also recognizing that individual actions, refusing to fly, growing one's own food, and adopting a diet that eschews animal products are not enough in and of themselves in our current moment. When Bruce killed himself right before I taught my last graduate course of this semester, a course focused on environmental literature that ended on April 26th with a discussion of Richard Powers' 2018 novel, The Overstory. We talked about Bruce in the context of The Overstory's Patricia Westerford, a character based on the life and work of Susan Simard, an ecologist who coined the term mother tree in her work on the ways that trees communicate with and mutually support each other. And I could say a lot about Simard and the way that her scholarship was originally kind of just ignored and then revived decades later by other people who were men, but I won't. Near the end of the novel, Westerford is speaking at a conference and she asks, what is the single best thing a person can do for tomorrow's world, just before possibly killing herself in front of her audience? The novel leaves it very ambiguous. So what is the single best thing that a person can do for tomorrow's world? That is a question that has plagued me since I became vegan in 2001. Is this the best thing? Is my choice not to have children the best thing? Is self-immolation, as Bruce must have believed, the best thing? In the present moment, I am reeling. A leaked document that revealed that the US Supreme Court of the United States is going to overturn Roe versus Wade, the landmark 1973 decision that made abortion a constitutionally protected right for women. This happened earlier this week. This will be the first time in the history of this country that a constitutional right will be taken away from people and taken away by that supposedly co-equal branch of the US government before which when Bruce set himself on fire, an act that Thich Nhat Hanh recognized as the articulation of profound significance. Quote, to burn oneself by fire is to prove that what one is saying is of the utmost importance. There is nothing more painful than burning oneself. To say something while experiencing this kind of pain is to say it with the utmost courage, frankness, determination, and sincerity. And if this vocalization of the utmost importance was ignored, what of women's bodily autonomy? What of the bodily autonomy of non-human animals? On Thursday of this week, the US Senate passed a measure barring our President Biden from declaring a climate emergency, even after when Bruce set himself on fire, asking for this to happen. As Mimi Ma, another character in Richard Powers' novel, says, humankind is a thug, the law is a goon. And later, another character muses, the law is just the human will, written down. The law must let every acre of living earth be turned into tarmac if that is the desire of people. And of course, the self-guided destruction of the natural world, our refusal to engage with climate change, the domination and slaughter of animal bodies for food, and the control of women's bodies are all dictated under the mandates of the law. It's worth noting that during the state of the pandemic, meat packers, a labor force that tends to be made up of often immigrant labor and other marginalized groups, died in higher numbers than the general population, even as they were mandated to maintain production, even if they had COVID. According to a 2020 report of the Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting and from USA Today, as outbreaks spread through the meatpacking plants across the country, some experts warned that Triumph, which was one of the worst impacted plants, and others in the industry would choose production over worker safety. Since then, workers and their unions have accused companies of doing the bare minimum to protect staff and time and again, finding ways to keep their lines running, unquote. Bernardo Serpa, a worker at the second largest pork processing plant in the United States, Triumph Foods in Missouri, claimed that the company owners, quote, think workers are like dogs. If we don't work, they get rid of us. And in any case, they get new workers, unquote. After spending 4 months in a coma, dying of COVID, Serpa, the Cuban immigrant, died. And he contracted his COVID infection at the plant where he worked. So, all right, moving on. I want to talk about tricks of rhetoric, plant-based misogyny, and the erasure of the empathetic imperative. And I'm hoping that all of this is kind of looping back on itself. In his 2000 book, Kitchen Confidential, the work that launched his career as a celebrity chef, Anthony Bourdain wrote about vegans as the, quote, Hezbollah-like splinter faction of vegetarianism, noting that vegans are, quote, a persistent irritant to any chef worth a damn, the enemy of everything good and decent in the human spirit, and an affront to all I stand for, the pure enjoyment of food. So in 2015, as I mentioned, I published a book called The Vegan Studies Project that was prompted in part by Bourdain's statement, as well as the aforementioned editorial by Harold Fromm. I pursued my study out of curiosity about the reasons behind the vitriol that veganism seemed to incite within certain, often male-dominated aspects of American culture during the first decade of the 2000s. And I learned a lot in writing that book, particularly in terms of the complex history of veganism, ecofeminism's role in championing veganism, the marginal but growing acceptance of veganism and vegetarianism that seemed to be taking place in the United States in the 1990s, and the subsequent backlash against presumed non-standard American diets that ensued over the next 20 years. So in the wake of reading Ethan Varian's December 28th, 2019 editorial, it's called Plant-Based, look it up, I saw how much of what I wrote about. And all of this is so interesting to me because these things seem to happen like right ahead of the pandemic. The warning from the scientists, this particular editorial, various other things that sort of just feel like they were harbingers of what was going to happen. And I'm using that word intentionally. Okay, so this editorial, it's called Plant-Based, look it up. I saw how much of what I wrote about in terms of prejudice against vegans tacitly underscores Varian's entreaty for a shift in thinking about the ways we characterize diets that, in their insistence upon a reduction in meat consumption, are increasingly divergent from the standard American diet, even as Varian fails to link this distancing from veganism as being predicated upon the fact that veganism, or plant-based eating, is currently increasingly practiced by men, including those paragons of masculinity who appear in the 2019 documentary, The Game Changers. And I don't know if you've seen that, but it's Arnold Schwarzenegger and a bunch of other like super strong guys who talk about being plant-based as if they've just discovered the fact that veganism exists. In my book, I have a whole chapter on the way that masculinity is challenged by a vegan diet, given that veganism is most often practiced by and associated with women. In 2010, the Boston Globe coined the term hegan as a way of differentiating men from female vegans, particularly men who had lived carnivorous lives and suffered health setbacks as a result, only to become vegan later in life. So it's kind of like they earned their chops as meat eaters, had heart attacks, and then decided to stop eating meat. So I understand Varian's desire to push back on the use of vegan to an extent, to denote all plant-based diets. He's right. Vegans can be a tough crowd, particularly when people claim to be vegan and then fail at it. Veganism is, after all, as much an identity category as a diet, predicated for most vegans on an ethical position that recognizes and protests the suffering of animals in the production of meat, dairy, and eggs for human consumption. In fact, on January 3rd, 2020, a court in the United Kingdom ruled in favor of a vegan who was fired for being vegan, noting essentially that, quote, ethical veganism qualifies as a philosophical belief protected under UK law, unquote. Varian notes, on the other hand, that there are lots of plant-based eaters out there who are, quote, free from those specific ethical constraints, unquote, and don't want to be lumped in with those of us bound by them. So even while I get it, in reading Varian's argument, I found myself increasingly troubled by a call to be considered plant-based, that is based on a lack of empathetic recognition of suffering. But even more significantly, I found myself, again ethically, implored to note the implicit misogyny that underscores a recent spate of product placement and plant-based pontification, Varians included. These entreaties are focused on the deletion of veganism from the history of so-called plant-based eating that has long been championed by women, again, like Carol J. Adams and others, who view ethical veganism as inherently eco-feminist and that necessarily recognize the linkages between a lack of empathy for and oppression of the environment, animals, women, colonized subject, and the planetary destruction facing us in the current moment. Whenever a movement that has traditionally been championed by women finds its way into the mainstream, women's contributions and foundational work getting us to this place are often ignored, erased, and renamed. As is apparent in the Game Changers, men get to change the game. To refuse to use the term vegan while managing to speak the same truths that ecofeminist vegans have been speaking since at least the 1970s, as if those truths are somehow new simply by virtue of their being rebranded. Ethical veganism is too political. It's a position, not a solution. But more importantly, it's a threat. Just ask the two guys in a pickup truck with a gun rack loaded with hunting rifles who pulled up beside me while I was putting gas in my car. This was some years ago, and told me that I should eat meat. And one called me sweetheart. Obviously, in response to the vegan sticker I had on my bumper. That sticker is now gone, by the way. Having it in the wake of that harassment, having it in the wake of everything that's happened over the course of the past 7 years or so has made me feel unsafe, and I removed it. It's important to acknowledge that an insistence upon plant-based is an insistence on an ethical imperative is not important, that it's overly emotional and overly feminine. Plant-based is safer. It lets us off the hook, letting men eat vegetables without the residual fear of being emasculated by their diets. So shifting gears for the last time, in 2018, I'm going to shift to 2018, even further back. At the age of 29, I'm sorry. Hang on, I'm sorry. Ocasio-Cortez became the youngest person and the first female member of the Democratic Socialists of America to be ever elected to Congress. According to Charlotte Alter, AOC is her initials, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is a politically polarizing individual, a kind of human Rorschach test, Wonder Woman of the left, Wicked Witch of the right. She is a Hispanic New Yorker who ran on a platform that included environmental sustainability, the abolition of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency called ICE, and wanted Medicare for all. She coined the term the squad to denote four Democratic freshman congresswomen of color made up of herself, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts, and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, who embodied the progressive political ideology, multi-ethnic diversity, and feminist empowerment that characterize the far left of the Democratic Party. They have faced, wait a second. Sorry, I keep losing my place. They have faced vitriolic, sexist, anti-immigrant, and anti-Muslim attacks as a result. With regard to the Green New Deal, a consistent drumbeat from critics on the right has focused on the imaginary danger it poses to hamburgers. Among various critiques of the Green New Deal, quote, few capture the alarmism of the American right quite like Sebastian Gorka's now viral claim that the deal's proponents, quote, want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamt about but never achieved, unquote. Aside from the utter ridiculousness of this assertion, the Green New Deal does not call for a ban on hamburgers, nor does it mention beef or cows, even as it asks that farmers and lawmakers work together to remove greenhouse emissions from agriculture whenever technologically feasible, in quotes. AOC has gone so far as to say that the Green New Deal is not about forcing, quote, everybody to go vegan or anything crazy like that, unquote. People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals have criticized her for not being vegan, asserting that the Green New Deal should include vegan food policies. Regardless of the fact that veganism is not part of the Green New Deal and that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is not vegan, coerced veganism has become an imaginary threat posed by the squad. And in this way, in the US, veganism functions as an implicit dog whistle to signify the rising influence of women immigrants and people of color, non-Christian religious ideologies, and policies that might address actual climate change. So just ahead, and going back again, this is my last point, just ahead of the pandemic, again, in the summer of 2019, Cherokee guns in rural Murphy, North Carolina, where I live and teach. I'm in a very rural part of the state of North Carolina, which at present has a Democrat as governor, but is a Republican legislature. The Republican Party controls our legislature. So it's a very strange place to be. I'm in the southern part of the United States, and I'm in a very rural part of the United States. So just ahead of the pandemic, in the summer of 2019, Cherokee guns in rural Murphy, North Carolina, near where I live and teach, advertised via billboard that read, quote, "The four horsemen cometh," with cometh slashed out, "and are idiots." Above photos of the congresswomen of the squad, it was signed "The Deplorables," a reference to Hillary Clinton's 2016 assertion that some of Trump's supporters were a basket of deplorables. Due to public outcry against it, the billboard was subsequently removed by Allison Outdoor Advertising, and actually the FBI got involved. I found out yesterday when kind of looking back at this issue, the FBI got involved with this because of the threat that it implies to these particular women. The biblical nod to the harbingers of the apocalypse is an appeal to evangelical Christians, a reassurance that these women, however evil, are too stupid to bring about the end times. But the reference also shows the fear that these women inspire in store owner Doc Waclaws and men like him, who has stated that he believes that the two Muslim congresswomen, Omar and Tlaib, have ties to terrorist groups. The removal of the billboard did not stop Waclaws from selling bumper stickers with the same image of the women whose opinions so offended President Trump's sensibilities that he suggested that they go back to the countries they came from, even though all but Omar were born in the United States. In targeting the squad, Waclaws claims that channels former President Trump's directive, missing the fact that Cherokee Guns is in Cherokee County, so named after the Native Americans who still live there and whose ancestors were violently displaced during the 1800s by people like Waclaw's ancestors, who, of course, came from somewhere else. In an ad posted on Cherokee Guns' Facebook page, the directions to potential buyers note that in order to get a sticker, quote, "Eat a piece of bacon, tell us you're voting for Trump in 2020. Liberals and snowflakes are not eligible." The admonition to eat bacon and say that one is voting for Trump in 2020 was clearly linked to Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric and travel ban. It was also about masculinity, a confrontation to diets that are perceived as feminine or ethnic for that matter, those that eschew meat, those that are vegan, those that are associated with the cause, with the squad, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in particular, and with the Green New Deal. The mere act of eating bacon constitutes a symbolic reordering of the world. The eater is not Muslim, is manly and American, and animals, women, immigrants, Native Americans, and the environment cannot assert any sort of primacy. In the discussion of bacon, the animal, the pig, is absent. But President Trump had regularly referred to women he did not like as animals, pigs in particular, particularly dogs and pigs. So the consumption of bacon can be read as a literal and rhetorical violence against a variety of beings, actual pigs, Muslim, women, non-Christians, and immigrants, all of which is predicated on an unironic appropriation of Cherokee, the Native peoples erased in the legacy of Manifest Destiny and capitalist expansion that led to the establishment of Waclaw's gun store, a monument to the Second Amendment's guarantee of the right to bear arms, even as the US's epidemic of gun violence has shown, at the expense of everything else. So finally, in North Carolina, bacon evokes the hog farms that function as a staple industry rife with cruelty, environmental devastation, and labor practices that disenfranchise minority communities, including those that were forced to work through the pandemic and died at higher rates of COVID. In 2016, ag-gag legislation was passed prohibiting whistleblowers from taking video of conditions in factory farms in my state, protecting potential wrongdoers, and enabling cruelty. From a vegan studies perspective, an analysis of this billboard is layered. And I have a note to add something to this, as is the climate crisis roadmap that those 11,000 scientists use to prod us toward veganism, and provides us a retrospective recognition of potentially apocalyptic proportions. It offers an ecofeminist intervention that exposes the implicit linkages between climate change, the historical violence enacted on Native peoples, and the contemporary violence enacted against livestock, animals, women, people of color, Muslims, and immigrants more generally in the United States, and the ways that such violence has become increasingly permissible and weaponized in the current moment. It restores the absent reference, which is Carol Adams' terms for what happens to animals when they are turned into meat, of the pig, to the narrative about the consumption of bacon. And perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates the ways that the pervasive toxic politics of corporate animal agriculture infuse political and social discourse in ways that are often invisible, unrecognized, yet incredibly damaging. Thank you very much.